Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Bluefly Town Hall on June 26, 2026. We have Martin Anderson-Clutz here today with us. Thank you so much for coming onto the call here with us today, Martin. You've really been in the Drupal community since, I think, version 4.6, I think I saw. What would you say that's something about Drupal today that still genuinely surprises you or excites you?
Well, so the reason I got started using Drupal now over 20 years ago was really the multilingual capabilities. And I think actually today that's still a really strong capability for Drupal, the ability to manage content across different languages. Today, even more powerful because you can use like TMGMT and different kinds of like workflow tools to make all that stuff even more automated. So it continues to be really strong. I guess, it was unfortunate that, when Drupal Canvas came out, that we've had a bit of a lag in terms of really being able to use that on multilingual sites to the same extent. But I know there's work. There was even a 1.7 release of Drupal Canvas today that has some capabilities around that hidden in sort of like a dev thing that you have to go on the command line to enable. But at least, there's signs of progress there. So, but yeah, multilingual is probably the big thing, obviously, in the last year or two, I guess. A lot of the AI things that are going on in Drupal are very exciting. And I think, initially it was sort of cool to like play around with it, like from an end user perspective, but really more recently, as we're going to talk about, really starting to use it from a development standpoint has really, the last couple of weeks even been pretty mind-blowing, I would say.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And, I suppose I should make sure that you get a chance to really introduce yourself as well. For anybody that might not know who you are or might not have heard from you in a while, I know that maybe just kind of marry this with what you've recently moved into a senior product marketing role at Acquia. Is that right?
That is correct. So yeah, I moved from being in the pre-sales team at Acquia into being more of a product managing role, product marketing manager, I should say. And so it's definitely been a bit of a shift. I think the irony is that when I was in pre-sales, I was always a bit of a like odd man out in the sense of like a lot of people were just happy to sort of stay at home and only go out when they had to go to customer meetings. Whereas I was always really passionate about going out to camps and trying to write content and maintaining modules and a bunch of other things, doing thought leadership things. And so I feel like I was always sort of like stretching the boundary a little bit of pre-sales. And so when I heard about this role that was really product marketing, but specifically for Drupal, and then, in the job description, a lot of these things of like, speaking at events and, producing content and a bunch of things that I've always, been pretty passionate about. And so it just seemed like a really good fit. It's definitely an opportunity to learn a whole new set of skills, which for me is very exciting as well, around sort of, product marketing, learning sort of go-to-market strategies and some other things as well. So yeah, I would say it's been really positive so far.
And this was, how long ago did you get into this role now?
I started, technically I was sort of in transition through the month of March, but
Gotcha.
Towards the end of March, really just going into DrupalCon was sort of,
Right.
as I was, sort of moving more directly into the role. So
Have you been there in the new role long enough to really feel like that you've started to have some traction within those new job responsibilities as well? Any particular events or projects that you can talk about?
Well, so the thing that I've been really trying to lean into probably the last, 6 to 8 weeks is really more around, so a couple of things. So number one, I guess overall, really sort of content creation, specifically doing things like when I go to events, trying to sort of get like a post that talks about, whatever the keynote was, so that, people who couldn't attend can sort of, understand, what's the main topic of discussion sort of thing, trying to get that out right away. But then I've been doing sort of a couple of different series of content. So one being around site templates, because I sort of felt like I can't remember. There was something I was trying to write up one day, and I just wanted to drop a link into something that was sort of like explain what site templates are in Drupal, and couldn't really find anything that really felt like it told sort of a good comprehensive story about that. And I thought, well, okay, well, maybe that's a good opportunity to go out and start to create that. So there was one that was sort of an introduction to the concept, another one that was a bit more technical in terms of like, what a site template actually consists of, and some of the technical parameters, how you can create one, those kinds of things. There's going to be more in that series coming. And then lately, it's also been a series about vibe coding and sort of my experience of having been inspired by things like the AI Learners Club, and then really using that as sort of the impetus to start using some of these tools. And some of the things that have gone well, not everything has gone well, obviously, AI being what it is, but really being surprised at some of the things that it's allowed me to do that I probably wouldn't have even attempted without having some of these tools available.
Oh, for sure. That AI Learners Club has been probably one of the most exciting things, I think, in the Drupal AI space that I've seen happen over the past couple of years now. Just the sort of excitement and folks really coming together and sharing with each other so openly. Speaking of, you wrote recently about the using Claude and Codex to build Canvas field component. And and it described some real friction along the way that you had. Like how did the experience kind of change how you approached the workflow as you went along with that Canvas field component work?
So I guess one of the things that I've really seen, it can be tempting. You'll hear about people who are like, oh, I just gave it like this big long task and then I let it run overnight and it came back in the morning. And it's like, yeah, that can work sometimes, especially if you can really make sure that you give it enough sort of contextual information that it's going to have, more or less all of its questions answered, enough direction to really stay on track. But I guess for myself in day-to-day usage, what I find is there's actually a lot of value in sort of, just being, looking over its shoulder as it starts to do things, and as it starts to describe, the path that it's going down. There's definitely times where you're like, that is the wrong way to approach that problem, and so stop it, give it some new direction, redirect it a little bit, and you're going to get to the result that you want faster. Burning less tokens. Probably to some degree higher quality, depending on, the direction you can give it. But, definitely that's one thing I would say is keep an eye on what it's doing, and don't be afraid to sort of stop it and jump in and say, hey, you're doing it wrong.
So even maybe in the case where you have agents, really kind of controlled around a plan or anything like that, even you'd still want to have some sort of checkpoints, I think, for human check-ins to make sure that things are going the direction that you are looking for as well. But it sounds like that your interaction might have been more plain, like just assistant sort of chat sort of. Is that the way that you were using it?
So the way that I've been using it most, particularly for sort of Drupal contribution, is directly in sort of VS Code. So having it in kind of a panel there. I've found that having it in the IDE definitely makes it the most capable, it seems like, to sort of run tools. So it can sort of not only make code changes, but actually then run the tests to validate that, it changes the output to what you're expecting. Or, in the case of having it, fix some unit tests that are broken, it can rerun the tests themselves once it's done to just sort of make sure that they actually pass and those kinds of things. So it seems to do a better job of that when it's actually running in the IDE. To date, I have been using more of the chat style interface in there. I think that was recently updated in VS Code, where you can do more of the Claude Code style interface. So I may switch to that at some point, but so far, this has been working pretty well for me. The other thing that I did recently, I was wanting to, I guess it was because I was wanting to blog about some work that I had done, on the full calendar module. And I couldn't remember some specific parts of the interaction because, if you spend enough time vibe coding with some of these tools, it can start to blur together. But I wanted to see some examples of where I had sort of interrupted it and redirected it. And so I actually went into Claude, directly in the same interface, and I said, create this report of all of the times I've interrupted you, and then, give it so much context in terms of like the things that led up to that and all that. And it's actually pretty cool that you can just sort of like, even get it to sort of, tell on itself in some ways that way. So, it has access to all kinds of the data. And so it's really cool that you can just sort of like get it to go in and mine some of that stuff and sort of tease out any specific insights that you might be looking for that way too.
Oh, that's neat. And maybe specific to the Canvas field component, did you have anything like kind of learnings that you had working with that?
So that one was, the thing that was interesting on that one is, Canvas wasn't really designed to kind of be extended in the way that Canvas field component required. And so there was a lot of sort of like, there was an early point where it sort of said like, you can take this path and here's why that's probably not recommended, or you can do this other path, which I think was like actually patching Canvas, but I kind of felt like going down that route was like probably even more sort of subject to potential problems down the road. And so there were sort of like design decisions that we made early on that we had to sort of like revisit every so often. And then I think there was partway through, somebody pointed out there was a different Canvas module, like add-on module, that had some differences in terms of the way that it plugged into Canvas. And so ended up sort of like going back to the AI and saying like, hey, use this as an example. And now like, see if we can take a different approach here. And so since then, there have been a couple of times where I found it really helpful to point it to an example that's sort of like, if not along the lines of what you're trying to do, maybe sort of like analogous to what you're trying to do, to say like, here's a thing that works kind of the way I want my thing to work. And it can actually do a pretty good job of like analyzing that and then sort of transferring that onto what you're trying to do as well. So even if you're not sure, like you don't want to write out the full like direction of exactly how to do it, to sort of say like, here's an example to go by, that can be, a good way to go as well.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So you might point to another module that's in core or otherwise that kind of does a similar thing is what you're referring to there. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was Canvas XJS. Off the top of my memory, I can't remember exactly. Like, I don't think I've ever used that one, but somebody pointed out that there was, I think it was because there's like a experimental submodule of Canvas, and originally the Canvas field component used that, it had that declared as a dependency, and somebody pointed out, well, this other Canvas XJS doesn't have that as a dependency. And so then I was able to go to the AI and say like, well, how come we need it, but it doesn't? And so then, from there, we were able to have a little back and forth and figure out.
Right. Well, and for folks that might not know what the Canvas field component is, what does it do and what use cases have you, like, why did it, I mean, if I remember correctly, you built it or you just enhanced it? I'm not sure what your level of involvement with Canvas field component is. Tell me about it.
Yeah, so Canvas field component was really sort of like my first kind of true foray into vibe coding, because I had never worked with Canvas. I had played around with it like as a, site builder sort of thing, but had never really like dived into the code at all. And it was actually for Drupal in the Day training. I think it was actually the Athens Drupal in the Day session that we did. I was getting ready to sort of like map out how did I want to try and teach Canvas. And one of the things that had recently been sort of made stable in Canvas was the ability to create the different templates. And so I thought, okay, that could be an interesting place to sort of like, because we had made the decision to work on Drupal CMS, so we was going to use the events recipe. And so I thought, okay, well, what if we use Canvas to make a template for the events content type?
Okay.
And then, which seems reasonable enough.
Structured content for some of that, I would think, and that's where the field component comes into play.
Well, so you can do that with Canvas, but the out of the box, the way Canvas works is you're meant to map your structured fields to components, to Canvas components. And that works really well where those mappings exist, but where the mappings don't exist, you're sort of stuck. There's no way to sort of like put those into anything else. And I've used Layout Builder a bunch of times and used it for exactly that use case of saying like, I'm going to take this content type and like, put stuff into 2 columns and, just kind of give it a quick layout sort of a thing without having to write code. And I just wanted to do the same thing with Canvas. And I was sort of surprised that there wasn't like, I knew, from years of Drupal development that like to render a field in Drupal is like a line of code, right? So, so it seemed like it, like how hard can it be, right? So that was like the perfect thing to sort of say like, I'm going to use AI to try and implement something that basically takes that like one line of code that you need to render a field in Drupal and then wrap that in whatever code is required to sort of shove that into Canvas. And there was a lot of iterating that went into it, but in the end, it works pretty well. And I've heard from a lot of people that had a similar experience to me, which is like, why doesn't Canvas do this out of the box? This is exactly what I need. And I think it'll be interesting. I had I guess a terse conversation with one of the Canvas maintainers who was like, yeah, there was like an internal class that you extended or something, or like a modified, decorated. And he's like, you probably shouldn't have done it that way, or at least like do it that way, but don't declare it stable because it's probably going to break before there's like, version 2 of Canvas or whatever. And that's fair enough. Live and learn, I guess. But it was sort of the spirit of vibe coding, got excited and got the thing released and out in the wild. So,
well, and I would be interested to know if like, I don't know if you'd thought of this specifically for this, but I seem to recall that with the AI Learners Club, there is a repo of best practices that they have been talking about recently, and maybe things like that, those sort of coding best practices could be respected somehow, either by your or other, chat people, folks that are kind of doing the same vibe coding to some degree, maybe more than just the API docs do, right? So I don't know if you'd put any work into that at all, but it does kind of make me wonder about standards and best practices in general. Yeah,
it's definitely a good thing to sort of keep in mind. I mean, I will say AI is interesting because sometimes it will really be cautious and sort of say like, here's an approach you probably shouldn't take and why. But then other times, like I'll be troubleshooting an issue and it'll say, oh, well, there's missing a schema on this other module. So we'll just shove the needed schema into your module. And I'm like, that is absolutely not the way that to resolve this issue. We should like open an issue on that other thing and, open a merge request and all that stuff. But sometimes it just wants to really like shortcut, best practices and those things. So again, bringing that knowledge of like the right way to solve problems is definitely, where the human in the loop adds a lot of value as well.
And maybe moving on here to this next one, similarly, you have framed AI as a way to get a higher fidelity proof of concept faster. Would you say that it really did, maybe in this case or maybe some other cases, has that held up in practice that you've been able to do faster prototyping, just to be able to get through to that end product that you're trying to, that use case that you're trying to serve?
Yeah, absolutely. So Canvas Field Component was a great example because I had this idea. I sat down to sort of play around with it. Probably if I had been coding things by hand, trying to sort of like learn all of the, standards of exactly how Canvas works along the way, maybe within the first week, I would have had some kind of a working prototype. And then from there, another week or two before I could sort of get something that was a bit more reliable. And then only, like well down the line from there, be really ready to start thinking about how to extend the features of it. Whereas with the benefit of using AI to do a lot of the heavy lifting, really within a day, I had kind of a working prototype that did everything that I had originally thought of. And so then I started playing around with it and I got thinking, okay, well, with events specifically, SmartDate has these with what are called date augmenters that use third-party settings as a way to like enhance the output. And I thought, let's see if we can get that working inside Drupal Canvas. And so, I had some more back and forth. It took a few iterations, but we got there, and that was like beyond what I would have considered like the MVP. So, within a couple of days, I was not only like to a point where I was ready to share with people faster than I had expected, but like actually a more complete version than I would have probably originally set my sights on.
Oh, okay. So almost like that might be the benefit of AI kind of imagining, like other outside of the strict scope that you have set aside, that maybe that's why those kinds of vibe coding interactions can be really helpful or useful, is instead of necessarily like restricting, like, because I hear a lot of like, we want it to be scoped to this particular thing that it's doing, and maybe even make it more agentic and have these sort of interactions between agents that are going to really do these things autonomously. But really, maybe kind of the benefit of vibe coding from your experience, it sounds like, is that it also opens up like these other opportunities where you might not, that are actually beneficial. It's not always like a sort of stop, don't do that. It's a, oh, that's a great idea. Let's go ahead and keep that or incorporate that. So that's really useful.
Yeah, I mean, I would say you want to be careful. Like, number one, I wouldn't say like, just give it very vague direction of like, I want, this module to be awesome. Go make it awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Giving it lots of very specific things, sort of, like, and chaining those, I think is definitely what I would say is a best practice. So like keep it, each thing that it does tightly scoped, but then the benefit is that it can knock those off so quickly that you're left with extra time to be able to say, okay, well, maybe there are other things that, were kind of like nice to haves on your sort of original scope of work. Now you can actually go and deliver on some of those. So I actually had another example just in the past week where I was working on the full calendar module, because on Friday, the maintainers of the actual JavaScript library released version 7, the first stable release.
Mm-hmm.
And so Jürgen and I actually maintained that one together. And so we had some conversations of like, hey, what can we do to sort of be ready as quickly as possible? So like back during dev days, we use the contribution data sort of like try and get like, an initial working version of the version 7 integration. It was still a release candidate then. But we had done some like analysis and planning, again, using AI to sort of like look at the version 7 and figure out what are the deltas, so that like we could see where there were places where we actually needed to change the code. And so, did some of the work back then. On Friday, after we saw that there was a stable release, like literally within an hour, basically had like, the final pieces kind of set as far as like the original scope that we had set. And so then it was like, okay, well, now that we have a version 7 compatible, branch of the full calendar module for Drupal, like what else should we do to sort of make this even better? And so I actually ran a deeper analysis, found some other features that we didn't yet have support for. So, like dark mode and sticky headers and like a few other things that were like cool in the library, but, there just had never been a need in the Drupal module. So now, again, within, certainly within a day, maybe even less than that, had like basically like all of those features now built in support. And then it was kind of like, all right, well, there were still things that, like even when we started working on the module 2 years ago, that we had wanted to do, but had never had the time to implement. And so it was like, okay, well, on a roll, like, let's just keep going. So, it gave it lots of test coverage, which is the thing that we had never found the time to implement. Now it's got Ajax loading. So you enable it and it'll only like pull down enough data for the actual like piece of the calendar that you're looking at.
Oh,
and
nice.
and the last piece that we're working on is tooltip support. So being able to like pop up, event detail. And so, a lot of these are things that like we had wanted to implement for a long time, but, the effort that would have been required was enough that it was sort of like, okay, well, the next time I've got, 10 hours to sit down and like, chip away at that thing, I'll get to it. But, it always felt like there was enough of a hurdle that we just never did. Whereas now, if you've got a couple of hours, you can actually tackle something pretty sizable often with these projects.
That's really interesting to think about, because usually it is those nice to haves that don't get done. They're like that part of that 20%, that gets shoved off to some other phase or whatever, right? But in this case, this advantage, it sounds like that you're, I guess where my head is going with this is that honestly, in practice, those nice to haves are the wow factors often for those use cases. Like, for instance, the tooltip. Like, what are you saying? We didn't already have that. That's something I kind of would have expected out of the full calendar module, to be honest. So yeah, I mean, I think that, being able to not only achieve the MVP or whatever it is, like, let's get onto the new version, but also having those nice to haves. And so, yeah, I hear you that it's not necessarily doing something completely vibe coded. It's doing best practices with your AI setup, but also taking advantage of like this sort of analysis pieces on the front end and on the back end, those sort of conversational analysis pieces as well. So thank you for sharing about that. I do want to leave room for questions here in a minute, but maybe just real quickly, like, for the senior developers here and elsewhere within the Drupal community who haven't jumped in yet, which is like a smaller community, I would say at this point, but I think most folks at least have like used some sort of chat interface, whether it's they're just like Googling or whatever, and it seems to come up there, or otherwise. But for serious development, for those that are kind of hesitating, what would you say that might be the biggest misconception about what AI-assisted coding actually looks like? Where do you see people are still hesitating there?
I mean, I feel like the thing that I've heard from, let's say, a vocal minority in the community not even that long ago is like, AI is incapable of writing good code. And I feel like at this point, there's lots of examples where you can just say that's demonstrably untrue, certainly from my experience. But even, I know there are people working on, elements of core and, other popular projects, parts of Drupal CMS, I'm pretty sure. So, I feel like that's, there's not, I wouldn't put much stock in that. I think you have to give it good context, probably pick some things where you're more likely to have success for it and sort of like stack your wins over time. The other thing too is there are lots of small examples of where it can add value. Like even within VS Code, you can basically use GitHub Pilot for free. I don't know, you probably don't get a lot of tokens, but like it'll do really useful things like see where you're doing something repetitive and basically try and like prompt you as like, oh, if you want to do the next thing, just hit tab. So as an example, on the weekend, I had a bunch of code where there weren't sort of like, the one line method doc blocks. And so when I ran like a PHP, CBF, it actually generated them all blank. So I was like, okay, well, that's, part of the way there. And then I started to go through to actually just like sort of quickly write them. But as I started writing, it actually auto-completed the line for the description. And then once I accepted that, it could see that there was another one down below. And so I could just hit tab and go all the way down. Yeah. And it was one of those things where it's like, it's not a huge time saving, but it's like anytime you can make sort of bringing your code up to standard less tedious, I feel like that's definitely a win. The other thing that I really feel like is a lot of these AI tools take the excuses away from really following the best practices. So like for me, I'll be honest and say as a contrib maintainer, like when I got started working with Drupal, writing tests was not a thing that like was commonplace. And then I worked in an agency where, they sort of, the prevailing attitude was like, if we have a customer who will, pay us to write tests, then we'll write tests. But, until then, we'll just get it to where it works and then QA it and hand it off. And so it was a skill that I was like, I've done it on a few things. But lots of the things that I've worked on could use more test coverage. And so I've found that like using AI to write tests is a great, way to use it. So if you're not comfortable with it, like to write the features, at least having it help you to write, the automated test can be really good. Daniel points out it in the chat, having it, you can also have it write documentation for you. Or the other thing I've done is like, like with the tooltip module, did it in a submodule. So then after I had it working, I said, okay, now create a README that like explains how to use it. And it was great for that. I've also occasionally, once it's sort of far enough along, in terms of sort of like building out the functionality of a module, I'll say, write an agents MD file so that like, if I put it aside for 3 months, then come back and want to have it do something new, that like, it doesn't have to go analyze the code base. It has sort of like, a good starting point in terms of understanding the overall structure and how everything works. So there's lots of different ways you can sort of like leverage it to make itself, more efficient, or even to make like deterministic tools better, right? So it's, unit tests are a simple example, but like, having it make it so all of your CI tests, the code validation things, PHPCS and, ESLint and all those things, like getting it to where those are clean enough that you can, sort of like refuse failures on those is going to make all of your projects easier to maintain over time in ways that don't necessarily require AI on an ongoing basis, right? So
yeah, I kind of like that idea as well, having it be involved with those standard checks, or linting things, because I think the other methods that I've seen like previously were like either hooks on like Git commits or in CI/CD, pipelines of some kind, that will do checks there, but it's almost too late at that point. Having, suggest these things, but maybe not necessarily commit anything or whatever else, or block you from committing, but having it like be involved, like while you're actively doing the code changes on your local, I almost feel like that's an easier like pathway to actually being successful, to like get those things done that need to be done. So yeah, that's really interesting to hear about your experiences there. So I do want to move to like some Q&A piece. If anybody has any particular questions, thoughts. I see that Thomas, you had put in a suggestion to check out the Gas Town Hall /beads on GitHub repo. Anything more to say about that?
Yeah, this is something that it's part of Gastown, but it's really its own project. It's called Beads, and it's almost like a local task manager that you can have agents write their own beads, and they can just like write hundreds of them, and then you can group them, and it's just it's a really easy way to do exactly what Martin was saying, was giving the agents like a list of tasks, smaller tasks that they need to get done, and then managing those. So it's not like it's smaller than like a work item or an issue, but little tasks kind of. When we were at Pivot, I mentioned that to Dries, and Dries said that he had just heard about that a couple days ago, and then he pinged me, DM'd me a couple days later, and was like, "This is amazing. I'm totally using it." Like on all my workflows.
Have you tried beads yet, Martin?
I have done. I mean, I will say, like, I still feel like I'm very low on sort of the learning curve in terms of getting to use all these tools. So the good part is just by getting in and getting my hands dirty and, actually figuring out some real world use cases, I've definitely learned a few things that have been helpful for me. But like you talked about the, I think it's best practices or Drupal best practices for AI, something like that. I can't remember the name of the repo, but I've kind of looked at that. I haven't actually really used it much myself yet. So that's one of those things that, probably in the near future, I should be trying to sort of see what institutional knowledge I can leverage out of that, because there's a lot of incredibly smart people who have contributed to that. And so I'm sure, yeah, there we go. AI best practices. So yeah, there's definitely, lots more to learn. So
yeah, well, and maybe contribute back to as well, so it would be interesting to see if something like that example you had pointed out, maybe would be a thing to be included in this sort of effort. Luke, how are you doing?
I am well. Hey, Martin. Speaking of institutional knowledge, and I know you're going to have to tread carefully with this one, because you know about lots of unreleased things in Acquia land that you can't talk about. But I want to give you a chance to talk about things you can talk about. I've noticed there are actual Acquia products that are incorporating AI in sort of interesting ways. And I don't really know about them other than like seeing them flash by a screen and being like, oh, what was that? So I'm kind of curious, like what are the things that have come out, say, recently that you think we should pay attention to?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely happy to talk about some of those things. So, I would imagine that a lot of folks have sort of heard, at least, as you say in passing, maybe talk about what we call Acquia Source, which is kind of like a SaaS version of Drupal CMS, but it has a number of interesting capabilities. So, number one, one of the things that we've started rolling out to customers is sort of like an AI interface that's built into your actual Acquia cloud subscription. And so from that, you can do things like, monitor the health of projects across all of your different projects. It's going to have different AI capabilities. So you can sort of, as a marketer, say, like, this is the end that I'm looking to achieve. And then that'll sort of like spin up an agent that'll go off and do different things. So if you're like, I need an additional environment on this particular application for XYZ, it can go off and do that, as opposed to like, you having to go in and find the documentation and then go in and implement that yourself. So there's some pretty interesting things in there. I think there's going to be probably, more and more capabilities in the coming months around all of that, but that's definitely a very exciting area. Within Drupal CMS, Source CMS, we have the conductor integration. And so again, having that tied directly into the CMS means that AEO is sort of a hot topic for lots of folks. And so the ability to, as you're creating a piece of content, even before you publish it, to sort of make sure that the keywords that you're optimizing for are sort of like best of breed, not just from an SEO standpoint, but also in terms of like, what are the things people are asking answer engines for? And so those kinds of things. So, having some of those AI enhanced capabilities, as well as the ability to enhance for AI LLMs, I think is pretty interesting. Trying to think what some of the other areas are.
The conductor one, is that this content optimization module? Is that what you're talking about there? Okay. It's just linking to it in the chat there. We actually do have Acquia Source here with Bluefly that we've been playing around with to some degree, and working with that product to, like I said, to some degree. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what additional AI optimizations are coming out of the Acquia products. Any others that you wanted to mention?
I'm sure there's some that I'm, forgetting. I mean, I definitely know sort of like built into things like, Edge, there's more and more intelligence going into some of those things in terms of sort of like identifying bad actors and bots. But, these days my focus is actually still more on the Drupal side. So, I know like even in the 1.7 release of Canvas today, there were a couple of new enhancements around sort of the AI chat that's built directly into Canvas. Certainly guardrails, within the AI ecosystem is something that there's been a lot of active development around. So yeah, as I say, for my own focus is more directly on the Drupal side, but if folks want to do a deeper dive on some of the Acquia AI capabilities, would be happy to sort of provide some additional information after the fact.
Awesome. Thank you, Martin. Any other questions? We have a couple minutes left, folks. Daniel, yes.
Yeah, I have two. Thanks for being here. I'll just list my questions and you can decide which one you'd prefer to start with. One is, I have a little bit of a worry with Canvas that we've kind of done the same thing to ourselves as we did in the transition between Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. I feel like for a lot of Drupal developers, trying to use Canvas is as challenging as it was for a lot of site builders to start using Composer. And I think your module is actually like really important because I think it starts to bridge that gap, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that. The other question that I had was, I feel like all the marketing that I see about Drupal these days is AI and talking about integrating AI and in the best for AI and like those types of things. And I wonder if we're missing an opportunity to just continue to market some of the other things that are not related to AI, because there is, as we've like seen in this country, starting to be a lot of pushback against data centers and things like, and you know, the resources that are required for AI. So yeah, I'd be kind of curious to hear your opinion about that, knowing that you're doing a little bit more of the marketing work.
Yeah. Okay. So great questions, both. Maybe I'll start with the AI one. We'll see where the gong sounds, but it's a really interesting question. I mean, I definitely hear what you're saying. A lot of the focus has been on, I think, trying to capture, you know, up until very recently was a lot of excitement about AI, and particularly in the marketing world, people seeing that their budgets are shrinking, and so they see AI as a way to say, you know, even with a smaller budget, I can get more done. And so I think a lot of marketing departments in particular, like even the marketing department at Acquia, I would say as soon as I switched over to being in the marketing department, I could see that they were much more aggressive about AI adoption than, you know, certainly the pre-sales department that I had been in. And so I think it was partly meant to sort of capitalize on what was seen there. I think you're right that we're starting to see some, you know, other sentiments in the market there. You know, it's I think the fact that Drupal is very LLM agnostic actually, again, may give it a bit of a strategic advantage when you start talking about a landscape where you may lose access to particular models at different times without a lot of warning for reasons. And so having, you know, workflows that are designed where you can swap models, you know, with a couple of clicks, as opposed to like, oh, well, now we've just got to rebuild our entire workflow. There's an advantage there, right? But I hear what you're saying. Like, there are definitely things that are good about Drupal that have nothing to do with AI. You know, governance workflows, even like deterministic automation as a thing that you can do without writing code is pretty cool. Like, you guys had Jürgen on, I guess. I don't know if that was like a week or two ago.
Yeah, a couple
and
weeks.
I think, yeah, a lot of that stuff is just insanely cool. And you know, actually, you know, there are probably lots of sites that probably could get rid of a lot of custom code and just use ECA for a lot of the things that they've built, you know, by writing code instead. So I definitely think you're right about that. The other thing that's sort of interesting right now is we're also in a bit of a weird moment right now with Drupal, because I feel like we're actively moving away from Drupal core as like the product that we talk about. So, I mean, the fact that I think even Drupal 12, maybe, we're no longer going to have Olivero and, you know, included with core, because you're meant to use, you know, Drupal CMS as the thing that you start using Drupal with. And yet Drupal CMS is in this weird spot where, like, you know, I talked about multilingual earlier. Like, multilingual is a thing that, like, we're just starting to get maturity around, you know, using that with Drupal Canvas. And so we're kind of in this weird spot where it's like, it would be great if we could fully shift over to Drupal CMS as the product that we talk to marketers about, but it's kind of like not fully baked in some of the areas where Drupal core is actually still really strong. And so, yeah, we're kind of in a weird moment there, but I think you're right. Like, it shouldn't be only AI that we're talking to people about. So it's, yeah, we've got to sort of figure out like the right audience in terms of who we're talking to. I talk about some of the different things, like even performance is a thing where Drupal continues to make huge strides in terms of the speed. And if you look at like Core Web Vitals, where Google's data compares us, like, we're with the best in the CMS market and well above, you know, frameworks like Next.js that people used to say, well, I'm switching to Next.js because I want my sites to be fast. And it's like, well, Core Web Vital score for Drupal is like 60% higher than Next.js. So like, if speed is the thing that you care about, like, stick with Drupal, right? But we don't often get that message out. So I think you're right. There are definitely, you know, other things that we should be talking about as a community.
Well, thank you so much, Martin, for joining us here today. I'm sorry I would say that we don't really have any more time, but we'd love to have you come back sometime, and, you know, hope to see you in the event space as well sometime soon. So thank you, everyone, for joining, and have a wonderful weekend.